Welcome to the PIBD Digest, a podcast exploring inflammatory bowel disease, including Crohn's disease and colitis, with a focus on pediatrics. In each episode, we, your hosts, Dr. Tracy Coelho and Dr. Bakewell, both pediatric gastroenterologists, are joined by leading experts to provide insightful perspectives on this chronic condition.
Our aim is to support both healthcare professionals and families living with paediatric inflammatory bowel disease by sharing knowledge, experiences, and the latest research. But please note, the views expressed in this podcast are those of the speakers and our guests and are for educational purposes only. They don't constitute medical advice. Hi Tracy, and welcome back everyone to what is episode 2 of our journey into intestinal ultrasound. Hopefully none of our listeners have gone into full-on hibernation mode after the last one. It was pretty intense, but I'm sure you're raring to go, fully caffeinated.
Absolutely. I'm fairly certain a few of our ambitious listeners have already drafted a business case, ordered an ultrasound machine, and put themselves on the waiting list for the iBus course. I just hope their website hasn't crashed under the sudden wave of enthusiasm.
Yeah, I'm sure you're right, Tracy. I'm sure there's that much commitment. But seriously, for anyone who's quietly been flirting with the idea of setting up their own intestinal ultrasound service, I think this one's really for you. We're going to talk about real-world next steps, not just those motivational Dr. Coelho style ultrasound poetry recitals.
Fair point, you got me there. But poetry doesn't quite gel with a masterclass on ultrasound. And frankly speaking, the poetic echoes might just be confusing. Alright, we have 2 IUS enthusiasts joining us today, representing both ends of the gut spectrum. First, our adult gastroenterologist, Dr. Nik Plevris from Edinburgh, and bringing the pediatric perspective, our ever-enthusiastic colleague from Bristol, Dr. Kwang Yang. Yes, we may be a bit behind our adult GI counterparts, but I would prefer to call it age-appropriate strategic pacing.
Yeah, exactly. We're fashionably late, but scientifically keen.
Totally, no doubt about it.
Right then, no more rambling. Let's probe straight into the second episode in intestinal ultrasound. So I'm delighted to welcome our next guest, Dr. Nik Plevris, who is a consultant adult gastroenterologist at the Edinburgh IBD unit, but he's also an academic, a researcher, another proud member of the elite club of UK gastroenterologists trained in intestinal ultrasound. And not only that, Nik helped set up the first, or one of Scotland's first, IUS services for IBD. So welcome to the PIBD Digest, Nik.
Thanks very much for having me, Chris and Tracy. Pleasure to be here this evening. Thank you.
Welcome and thank you.
Pleasure's all ours. So Nik, imagine if you will, I'm a gastroenterologist, and maybe we'll pretend I'm an adult gastroenterologist for this purpose, who's trained in intestinal ultrasound and ready to launch a service in my hospital. How do I make a case to the hospital management? What arguments would you say really resonate, especially when it comes to disease burden, impact on patient care?
Yeah, and so I think that's, the first thing when you're talking about ultrasound, when you're trying to introduce this to your service is, how am I going to present this to management? And, business cases can be, for many, an incredibly frustrating part of our day-to-day job, but they're absolutely necessary. We work in a publicly funded service. Every proposed change needs to be transparent, needs to be justified. And that's not only in terms of clinical benefit, but also in efficiency and value. So, when you're talking about intestinal ultrasound and how you want to set this out, the first step is you need to demonstrate the scale of the problem. And you alluded to the burden of disease. And I think that's really key to put across. So, when we look at IBD across the UK, we can see immediately from the numbers of patients now that we're treating that this, is a big challenge for us. If we look at the current prevalence figures, over 500,000 of people live with Crohn's and colitis throughout the UK. And if you look at the projections, around about 1 in 100 patients, 1 in 100 individuals will have a diagnosis of IBD within the next decade. So, this is a big problem. And we know that these conditions are lifelong. They fluctuate. There's periods of remission and relapse. Patients don't just need a one-off assessment. They need repeated objective monitoring throughout their disease journey. And the thing that I think is really important is the way we deliver IBD care has fundamentally changed throughout the years. We've moved now towards this kind of treat to target era. We aim for harder endpoints such as mucosal healing, transmural healing. So this means more intensive monitoring, utilizing strategies like MRI, endoscopy. And this is, a really welcome shift, and we know improves the outcomes for our patients, but is far more intensive. And, this is where the pressure becomes obvious. And to give you some stats, we looked at this within our local trust. For example, MRI waits were going up to 3-4 months before a patient could get an MRI. We had an endoscopy backlog of over 9,000 cases, with hundreds of those for the indication of IBD monitoring. So, these delays aren't benign. They can lead to delayed treatment decisions. You can get unnecessary steroid exposures, hospitalizations, prolonged time on ineffective therapies. And so I think the system that we currently rely on simply can't support kind of modern IBD care. And that's, a really important thing that someone needs to highlight. And again, if you look at UK figures, IBD costs the NHS over £1 billion annually. The average cost per patient, for example, for UC is around £3,000 per patient per year. For Crohn's disease, 6,000, but that cost almost doubles when we're talking about individuals with active disease who are flaring. So when you're kind of proposing intestinal ultrasound, you're not really asking for a luxury or a new toy. You're offering a solution built for the era for which we now practice in, and a tool that is rapid, it's accurate, it's low cost, and relieves significant pressures on things like MRI, endoscopy, but also supports these treat to target pathways with the ultimate goal of improving patient outcomes at a far reduced cost. So, I think these are the key things that one needs to put across when trying to demonstrate the benefit of your business case.
Perfect. So building on that, let's talk about the clinical side. Now, what are the real benefits in clinical practice? For example, how useful could IUS be when a patient has an IBD flare, for example?
Yeah, so one of the most compelling aspects, I think, of intestinal ultrasound is how versatile it is. And its utility really can extend across virtually every phase of IBD management. And you mentioned one of those aspects, so managing patients in flare state. So many of us have flare clinics established into our care pathways. And if you incorporate intestinal ultrasound into the setting, I think it can be extremely helpful. Why is that? Well, ultrasound allows you to make kind of real-time assessment of disease activity. So you can tell the severity of disease, the extent of disease. You can even see complications of disease. And historically, this is something that we would rely on biomarkers, MRI, and endoscopy for. And the big difference with ultrasound is that you get that answer there and then. So you get an immediate objective picture of what's actually happening in the bowel, and it allows you to make a quick and confident decision in that flare setting. And, there's good data now to support this as well. So just one study, it was a study done in Australia, which looked at the benefit of implementing intestinal ultrasound into the flare clinics, showed by doing so, you reduced unplanned hospitalizations by 10% following that flare episode, and also avoided kind of urgent outpatient reviews in around 58% of the patients. So I think ultrasound in the flare clinic, it can be a really useful utility. But it's not only that. I think the benefit extends out with the flare clinic and also to routine outpatient setting. And there was some really nice data from the UK led on by William Bladd, where they performed a very elegant study where, very simple, they randomized patients in the outpatient setting to have point of care ultrasound versus standard of care. And what they were able to very clearly show is that the point of care ultrasound arm resulted in dramatically faster decision making. So I think the median time to definitive treatment decision was 0 days with the point of care ultrasound versus 58 days with the standard of care. And when we look at what that equates to in terms of actually starting treatment, it was 42 days in the point of care ultrasound arm versus 128 days in the standard pathway. So instead of kind of weeks of diagnostic delay, you can make clear, confident decisions at that same clinic, which I think is really transformative and improves care. And the other things to briefly mention are things like, where it can be useful are, for example, pre and post induction clinics. We have a whole host of advanced therapies now that we're using. I think we need to be using them diligently and making sure patients are responding appropriately to them. So incorporating ultrasound in that assessment to make sure patients are getting better and not continuing on therapies that aren't working, I think is really important. And I think it's also important to mention that patients also really like the test, and I think that's key. They prefer ultrasound as an assessment modality, and also, we can clearly see it removes those sort of bottlenecks in the current pathways that we have. It reduces anxiety around kind of repeated invasive tests, and just, I think, makes our care much more proactive, responsive, and sustainable in the long term.
So cost saving is going to be big as a priority for the NHS. And if you're going to pitch this to a manager or a hospital, they're going to expect some kind of financial cost saving compared to the other imaging. Realistically speaking, given the setup cost for purchasing the ultrasound machine, what would you expect to be saving? Could you put a number on it, or is it difficult?
So the cost-saving potential for intestinal ultrasound is extremely strong, and importantly, it's also supported by quite high-quality evidence. So one study to highlight, for example, is the study by the team at Guy's and St Thomas's. And what they did was they looked at all referrals for MRI and lower GI endoscopy. And they were able to show that around about 28% of the lower GI endoscopies and around 50% of MRIs could have been replaced by ultrasound. And when they modeled this, what they could show was that the projected annual saving for their unit was just under £500,000. And that's just one centre. And more and more studies are now showing that similar cost-saving benefit. So another one is by the team in Nottingham. What they did was they compared the cost per patient in an MRI pathway versus an ultrasound pathway for assessment of IBD. And again, they were able to show that MRI pathway was around £375 per patient compared to approximately £80 per patient in the ultrasound pathway. So MRI was nearly 5 times more expensive than ultrasound. And I think it's also important to remember that the cost saving doesn't just come from the test itself. So when we look at studies that show the benefit of ultrasound in terms of things like hospitalization, I already mentioned the Flare Clinic study in Australia, and they actually looked at cost savings as well. And they showed, again, that reduction in hospitalization equated to around about, I think, 150,000 Australian dollars that they saved. So there are indirect costs as a result of improving efficiency of care. And, we used a lot of this data to present our local data. And I think that's an important thing to highlight to people who are thinking about putting a case together, is that actually you can tailor this for the data within your health board, within your trust. So when we did it locally, we were able to say, well, if we introduce this service, for example, we can save just under £80,000 per year by replacing MRI and endoscopy. We could save another £30,000 to £40,000 by reducing the endoscopy backlog. £10,000 to £20,000 saved per year by reducing hospitalisation. £75,000 per year by allowing us to optimize biologic or de-escalate biologics. So, you know, I think there is a really strong cost-saving argument for introducing ultrasound. There is this data out there, and I think, you know, if people used that to model their own kind of service, they could present a very compelling argument to management.
Perfect. Now that's a very impressive pitch, and the hospital leadership likes your idea, but can't fund it through the capital budget. Now, what other options might exist? Could partnerships with industry or charities help make this happen?
So this can be something that we encounter quite frequently, and capital budgets are tight across the NHS. But I think intestinal ultrasound is the kind of project, I think, where alternating funding models can still work very well. I think what I would say is that a lot of hospitals out with the kind of standard capital funding streams do have things like innovation grants or invest to save schemes. And these are specifically designed for projects that are able to modernize treatment pathways, reduce waiting times, generate long-term cost savings for the NHS. So ultrasound fits those criteria extremely well. Now, the other thing is, you mentioned sort of industry, and I think industry can be a very good partner when it comes to ultrasound. So drug companies are now openly recognizing the central role that ultrasound will play in modern IBD pathways. And as a result, many are willing to support centers through things like training, research infrastructure, in some cases, direct contributions towards equipment. So it's definitely an avenue that I think, you know, someone should be exploring, talking to the industry partners that they know to see, you know, what options are available to them. The other thing I would say is on the research side as well. So many drug companies now are increasingly incorporating ultrasound targets or imaging sub-study components into their protocols. So that means they're looking for centers who are capable of performing high quality intestinal ultrasound, and these centers are much more likely to be selected for participation. Now, one of the benefits of being involved in clinical studies is that they can generate significant income, which can then be reinvested into the service. So if you have a kind of R&D budget that you can argue, if we use it to buy, for example, an ultrasound machine that will allow us to recruit into these studies, it can be a great sort of income generating thing for the service, and can then become almost a sustainable part of the service. You know, along the same, you know, also kind of talking about industry partnerships, I think speaking to the people as well who make the machines and provide the machines, I think is important. And for many of these companies, gastroenterology represents an entirely new customer base. So traditionally they would have worked with radiologists, maybe obstetrics, emergency medicine, but GI is a new kind of market for them. And with that, I think comes opportunities for things like preferential pricing, maybe extended loan periods or long-term demo units. And, you know, I think asking these questions to the machine providers is key. And this can really be, you know, this can help lower that barrier to establishing a service and allowing you to get things up and running. But beyond industry, you know, you alluded to things like charities, and there are things like hospital endowment funds as well. And these are other potential routes that one can use to help start up the service. And traditionally these organizations will routinely support projects that help improve the patient experience, and there's very good argument for that with ultrasound, or they will want to fund things that help modernize clinical pathways. And again, ultrasound fits very nicely into that remit. The one thing that I would say, though, is don't always take no capital funding as the end of the conversation. And I think many budgets that are allocated in the hospital end up being underspent. And the reason is departments are actually very cautious about overspending, almost too cautious. And what you find is that sometimes at the end of the funding rounds, there is a bit of money left over. And I think it's a real opportunity for you to get in there and put in a small capital bid to buy an ultrasound machine, because in the grand scheme of things, it's actually a small amount of money. These bids are usually for hundreds of thousands of pounds, maybe millions. So, your bid is relatively small. And to try and make it successful, you need to kind of get the service managers, get the financial directors to buy into that vision early, get them to understand the clinical benefit, the cost savings, the wider impact. And you'll be amazed at actually how often support emerges. So, I think that's what I would definitely say is don't always take no as the final answer. Just keep on pestering.
Thanks, Nick. You're really presenting quite a compelling case. I feel like we need to get you down in Southampton and talk to a few managers. The last thing I was thinking, as part of the kind of 360 look at what the benefits would be for intestinal ultrasound, is the environmental side of it. Do you have any sort of experience or evidence to say that it helps reduce the carbon footprint in any way compared to endoscopy or imaging in other ways?
Yeah, 100%. So it's a very, it's that additional benefit, I think, of intestinal ultrasound, and it aligns really strongly with the things we're hearing from the NHS, which is trying to move towards a kind of net zero healthcare system. So both MRI and lower GI endoscopy have substantial carbon and waste footprints. And there was quite a nice recent systematic review that has showed a single MRI scan generates around 17 to 22 kilograms of CO2 equivalent. And actually in some high field system, that can rise to 300 kilograms of CO2 per scan. A typical colonoscopy produces around 8 to 56 kilograms of CO2, depending on things like sedation, ventilation, sterilization, volume of consumables that you use. So these modalities are actually some of the highest waste components of the IBD pathway. If you look at ultrasound in comparison, it generates only around 0.5 to 1.5 kilograms of CO2 per scan. So we're talking a tiny fraction of the footprint associated with MRI and colonoscopy. And importantly, these differences translate into kind of measurable real-world carbon savings. So again, a nice study from Ireland, which modeled an IBD clinic where MRI and colonoscopy follow-ups were replaced with point-of-care ultrasound. And they modeled it on, I think, 259 patients. And what they were able to show is that would equate to almost a kind of 3,300 kilograms of CO2 reduction in 1 year. So that's the equivalent of 15 round trips from London to New York. And that doesn't even take into account indirect benefits such as fewer hospital trips, reduced travel emissions, less waste from consumables. So I think absolutely, and it's something we should be thinking about. We should be asking about the environmental impact of what we do has, and I think ultrasound is a very elegant solution to try and minimize that impact.
Thanks, Nick. As a last question, I wanted to mention other specialties like rheumatology and a few others possibly already use ultrasound in their clinics. Could we use similar sort of equipment to share or repurpose for gastroenterology, especially if the investment is limited?
Yeah, so a very practical question, and the answer is yes, at least initially. So specialties like acute medicine, rheumatology, emergency medicine already use ultrasound extensively. And absolutely, many of the machines that they have the capabilities of performing intestinal ultrasound. The key is having the right probes to allow you to perform an adequate ultrasound scan of the bowel. And to do so, you need a high frequency linear probe and a low frequency curved probe. But that's exactly how we got set up in Lothian. It was a serendipitous walk through clinic. And I remember seeing this machine in the corner draped with this kind of green drape. And I'm thinking, what is that? And I went, and it was this £50,000 ultrasound machine that our colorectal colleagues used for the pelvic floor clinic. And after discussions with their clinical director, transpired they only used it once a week. So we were able to negotiate with them to allow us to use the machine. We were able then to purchase the probes that allowed us to do the intestinal ultrasound, and purchasing the probes is much cheaper than having to buy a machine outright. And that's what kind of got us up and running into the service. So 100%. And what I would say is, again, if people are looking for a machine, the people to get involved are medical physics. So they will hold an asset of all machines in the hospital. So you can go and ask them, can you give me a list of all the ultrasound machines? Where are they? What are their capabilities? Who owns those machines? And then you can approach those specialties to directly explore whether machines can be shared, whether the time can be split, or could you use them during specific windows in the clinic. And I think sharing equipment can help get the service off the ground. It can help support training and building early momentum. What you will find as demand grows, as you're using it more, that you quickly will justify needing your own machine. But absolutely, I think sharing equipment is an excellent starting point.
That's amazing, Nick. We have covered a lot of ground today. It's been a fantastic discussion. And you'll remember, you were one of my hijacked hostages from the IBD study day. So thanks so much for being such a good sport and joining us on the podcast. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Not at all. It's been my pleasure as well. Thank you.
So we're absolutely thrilled to welcome our ever energetic and enthusiastic GI colleague from Bristol, Dr Kwang Yang Lee.
Though with 2 babies at home, we might be testing whether those batteries are rechargeable. Kwang Yang is our very own paediatric GI ambassador for intestinal ultrasound, or should we say the transducer of paediatric IUS. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, it's a great pleasure to be here. It gives me a change from changing nappies and crying babies, so it's great.
Saying that, you look remarkably well rested.
It's the filter.
I know we discussed about nanny colleges and stuff, but towards the end of the question round, we may have a groundbreaking idea to childcare. So stay tuned. Should we get into the good stuff?
Yep, I'm ready.
So, Kwang Yang, you are in the process of developing an intestinal ultrasound service in your trust, which is very exciting. Could you tell our listeners why IUS is becoming so important and how it could help children with IBD?
Yeah, thanks, Tracy. So I'm a great advocate for intestinal ultrasound, and I really believe it's going to transform the care that we provide for our patients. Bowel ultrasound allows us to closely monitor bowel inflammation with a non-invasive tool, reducing the need for reassessment, endoscopy, general anesthetic, and small bowel MRI. There's also zero prep required. Your patients don't have to take liters of MRI contrast medium, which can be pretty unpleasant, or bowel prep, which is even less fun. As a point of care tool, you get to know instantly the state of your patient's disease. I mean, we've all been there, right? You see a patient in clinic, they have some niggling complaints, maybe some tummy pain, or their appetite isn't quite as good as it normally is. And it can be quite tricky to work out if these symptoms are because they have a flare, or if there could be a functional ailment. And of course, you don't want to escalate your patient's treatments unless you've got a really good reason to do so. You've taken the history, you've done a good examination, and you still aren't sure. So what would you do then? Normally, you send your patient away for blood tests, stool samples, schedule them for MRI, or book them in for endoscopy. And then depending on what the waiting list in your hospital is like, it could be weeks or months before you get an answer. Without ultrasound, you get your answer then and there as to whether there is active inflammation, and then you can do something about it. Your patient starts getting better quicker, and you're saving the family potentially a lot of hospital visits, and you're also reducing the time that the kids are off school and the parents are off work. Point of care bowel ultrasound also helps bring the patient and their family along with you. It makes a difference to the understanding of inflammatory bowel disease. When you can show them on the screen in real time, the children get really fascinated seeing their bowel on the screen. And I wonder if it's because it might be the first time they're really getting their heads around what's going on inside their gut and how it's causing them to feel unwell. Point of care ultrasound is fairly quick. It doesn't cause a patient a lot of discomfort, and it doesn't require that you prepare them for an examination. You can repeat the test as often as you've got the time for and as is clinically indicated. So for instance, in one of our patients who was admitted with acute severe colitis, I did his ultrasound probably around 6 times in total over the course, and I can't see that you would do that with endoscopy. They'll benefit from faster decision making, and they'll benefit from better understanding of their disease. And I think it's really going to become an indispensable tool for the paediatric gastroenterologist in the future.
Wow. What a statement, hey? I mean, it sounds amazing, and you've obviously offered up some really great points, and clearly it's something you're doing actively in your practice. So my question, I suppose, is given the history and how it's developed, it's, as with lots of things with paediatric gastroenterology, it's come via the adult gastroenterologists. We've kind of followed in their footsteps to a certain extent. So my question would be, how, or are there any differences if you're looking at a child compared to an adult, if we're using some of their data and some of their guidance as to how we're undertaking those studies? Is there anything we should be mindful of, or do we have to adapt it in any way?
So first of all, I think intestinal ultrasound is great for children. And in fact, it could be even better for children than for adults, because generally children have a thinner abdominal wall and they've got less intra-abdominal fat. And that means that the ultrasound beams travel better and they give you higher quality images. You can also use higher frequency probes that also contributes to better image resolution. On the flip side, however, if you're like me and all your ultrasound training was done in adults, scanning in children can actually take some time to get used to, because when you do intestinal ultrasound, it's a lot of it is about pattern recognition. And in children, sometimes you get so much resolution, so much detail that you actually you find it more difficult to interpret what you're seeing. So there is a bit of a learning curve when you scan children. Compared to adults, in my opinion, there's also a bigger role for handheld probes. So these are handheld ultrasound probes that you can carry in your pocket and that links to your mobile phone or an iPad or tablet. And these panel probes are less powerful, but much more portable. In adults, handheld probes often don't penetrate deep enough for you to make sound clinical decisions, or just because you can't see the bowel in sufficient detail. Not in all cases, but certainly there are probably more limited uses of handheld probes in adults, at least with current technology. With kids, handheld probes are often good enough. And with the model of care that we have in pediatric gastroenterology, where we are often doing outreach clinics to cover a wide geographical region. So for instance, the furthest outreach clinic that we do here from Bristol is in Coelho, which is about a 3-hour journey. And you can't lug around a full-size ultrasound machine in your car. The challenge with scanning younger patients is that they are not always the most cooperative. So you might find that you have less time to do your scan, and you might also need to use some distraction techniques to buy you some more time. And I've not seen this talked about in scientific papers, but I found that children are, in general, way more ticklish than adults. And so you've got to navigate that challenge. It can be really difficult. I mean, the worst thing you can tell a child who can't stay still is to stay still. But otherwise, the basic examination technique and sequence is the same, and you are looking out for the same things. So you're measuring bowel wall thickness, color Doppler signal, loss of stratification, etc. But where things are different is in the definition of what constitutes abnormal bowel wall thickness. So in adults, the cutoff point is usually anything greater than 3 millimeters. In children, the specific cutoff points for each age group is still an area of debate. For instance, so far the youngest child I've scanned is 6 months old, or was 6 months old, and you can't really expect someone of that age to have the same normal bowel wall thickness as someone who's age 60 years old, for instance. There was a report published by the Paediatric Committee of the International Bowel Ultrasound Group, or IBUS, earlier this year in the Journal of Paediatric Gastroenterology and Nutrition, or JPGN, and that suggests that we should be using a lower cutoff point of 2.5 millimeters to define what is abnormal bowel wall thickness in children. And for now, that's probably the sweet spot where you get a good balance of sensitivity and specificity. It also then becomes much more important to look out for these secondary parameters of inflammation, like I mentioned before, like the color Doppler signal and loss of stratification, mesenteric fat wrapping, etc. So yeah, lots of similarities in terms of the examination technique, but also differences in a greater role of perhaps handheld probes and also in what we define as pathology.
Excellent. So IUS is clearly here to stay in the adult IBD practice, and pediatric units seem to be catching up. Now, could you give us an overview of the pediatric GI units already using intestinal ultrasound routinely in the UK, across Europe, or globally?
Okay, well, in the UK, there are no pediatric GI units that I'm aware of using point-of-care intestinal ultrasound. So that's a short answer. That's because there aren't many people yet who are trained to do it, and lots of people have not even heard of it. And I don't know if either of you attended the ECHO Congress in Berlin this year. There's a association or group called the International Bowel Ultrasound Group, and they have a members meeting during one of these evenings. And I sort of just, I've just newly joined as a member, and I just went out of interest. And this is how ignorant I am, right? I was expecting it to be, a tiny little gathering, maybe, 30, 40 people. And I was absolutely gobsmacked to see hundreds of gastroenterologists there. And these are all people who are training or are already experts in intestinal ultrasound. And it was really interesting to hear about all the work that's going on in developing new techniques, new scoring systems, etc. And it was just it's an eye-opening moment for me to see how advanced things have really got to. And unfortunately, in the UK, I think the conversation is often still about whether or not intestinal ultrasound could be a useful tool. Does it work? And I think that really feels that we're in the Stone Age here, and I think we need to turn this around. Across Europe, the pioneers in intestinal ultrasound have been countries like Germany, Italy, and the Netherlands, and they have been using ultrasound in their IBD services sometimes for decades. And I mentioned the IBUS earlier, and that's the biggest organization globally that champions the development and implementation of intestinal ultrasound. There are also other organizations like IUS in North America and the Genius Group in Australia, which both also offer training, education, and networking in intestinal ultrasound. I'm part of the newly formed SFGAN Special Interest Group for Ultrasound, which is led by Katrina Mitrova, who's a fantastic pediatric gastroenterologist in Prague. And we have representatives in the group from Portugal, Israel, Italy, the Netherlands, and Poland. And besides these pediatric GI units, there are also centers in Croatia, the UAE, America, and Canada. And as I mentioned before, to my knowledge, and I'm happy to be corrected, there aren't any UK pediatric GI units currently offering a point-of-care intestinal ultrasound service, but I'm hoping this changes very soon.
Sure. And thanks, Kwang Yang. Obviously a pioneer yourself then. So with that perspective, maybe you could answer a question for me. how do you approach the conversation with the radiology department in your hospital? For example, you're a paediatric gastroenterologist in the UK that thinks you want to bring that into your practice. Do you think that's a sensitive conversation? Do you proactively approach them to say, I'm going to start scanning? Because, of course, from everyone else in the UK, it will be asking our radiology department to perform that scan of the small intestine or the large bowel to look for IBD.
Yeah, I think, we have got to work together with our radiology colleagues. I mean, I myself, as part of my training, I was trained by a radiologist. And I think, again, in the UK, it's because it's something that's pretty new in the UK, and everyone is used to radiologists doing ultrasound scans, and point of care ultrasound is always thought of something that's pretty niche. And I think that you want to have conversations with your radiology colleagues. And I certainly know some pediatric radiologists and the radiologists from the UK who are very keen to help us develop these techniques. And of course, where people are still a bit apprehensive, then I think with the growing evidence and with increasing adoption of this service across Europe and in the UK, I think this will become very clearly the way forward to improve care for our patients.
Cool. And so I guess the last question I'll ask on the back of that is, do you think it's going to be part of our routine training as pediatric gastroenterologists? Do you think it'll be absorbed into what we have to learn to become a consultant gastroenterologist? Or do you think it will always be something that you have the option to do once you start your own practice?
I think that we're in a pivotal moment for intestinal ultrasound in pediatric gastroenterology. To paraphrase Victor Hugo, there's nothing else so powerful as an idea whose time has come. And for years and years, intestinal ultrasound was pretty niche. It's something you would hear about in conferences as part way in your mind as something that's not feasible in the NHS. But we've got to the point now where ultrasound machines are so advanced and provide such good images of the bowel. They're getting smaller, with handheld probes now becoming available and higher in quality. There's also lots of ongoing research in intestinal ultrasound, and more we're learning how to use this tool effectively to care for our patients. So I definitely see it becoming an essential tool in IBD care in the not too distant future, and not just as an add-on. In the coming years, I expect point of care bowel ultrasound to become the standard part of IBD assessment and monitoring. The technology is there, evidence base is growing, and the pediatric community is catching up to our adult colleagues who are already using ultrasound as a first-line assessment tool in many centers across Europe and worldwide. And I think we'll start to see ultrasound built into routine IBD clinics, rapid access clinics, and ward rounds, and used at the point of care to answer practical questions like, is there active inflammation? Has the bowel improved since you changed your treatments? And are these symptoms due to inflammation, or is there something else functional going on? And because you get instant results, it shortens the feedback loop from weeks or months to minutes. You make a decision in the clinic itself. I think there probably will be, I don't know what your clinics are like, but I guess standard appointments are anywhere. It could be 15, 20 minutes for follow-up appointments. I think if you're going to offer ultrasound, then you'll have to restructure clinics a little bit more, because when we are doing a scan, depending on how much experience you've got in scanning and how complicated your patient is, it can take anywhere from 10 minutes to 20 minutes, so half an hour if you're scanning someone for the first time and they are complicated and you're not very experienced. So you've got to think about how you run your clinics. Before intestinal ultrasound can evolve as a routine service in pediatric gastroenterology, though, I think we need to get more pediatric gastroenterologists in the UK skilled up and trained. In the UK, as you all know, intestinal ultrasound isn't in the grid training curriculum, when our trainees aren't even signed off on colonoscopy at the point of their CCT. So I think it's something that will remain as something that people pursue after they complete their initial training. And at the moment, there is a good training program offered by the International Bowel Ultrasound Group, which I mentioned before. ESPGHAN is also starting its own training program as well, and there are going to be some exciting developments from there. we organized the first ever Basfgan bowel ultrasound taster workshops at the annual meeting in Newcastle earlier this year. And there was a lot of interest there. And hopefully we keep these workshops going on as an integral part of the meeting in future years. I think like other more specialized skills, for instance, like, therapeutic endoscopy, it probably will become the case that not every single gastroenterologist in every single center is trained to do it, but probably, maybe 2 or 3 people who could do it in each center. I think that would probably be sufficient, at least initially.
If anything, just to upskill, because you need the numbers to, if you're diluting a bit like endoscopy, if you're diluting the amount of people that are doing the procedure, then fewer procedures per person.
Yeah, but I guess the thing about it is, compared to therapeutic endoscopy, where, you may not get so many procedures per center per year, any medium-sized center in the UK has a few hundred patients. So I think, compared to that, probably more people could get trained.
All right, so time for a completely non-IBD hypothetical question. Now, after a few years, you're totally fed up doing intestinal ultrasounds, so you decide to take a break from the gut world, and just then, the airport authority in America offers you a bizarre but tempting job to develop a gastrointestinal border security force detecting the cross-border bowel movement of illicit foreign objects using intestinal ultrasound. So the perks are amazing. You can choose one of the following. 1. Free business class travel anywhere in the world for every successful catch. 2. A robotic sonographer designed by a tech giant, and it is called Scoptimus for your hospital IUS service. 3. A home robot called Hometimus to handle everything from childcare to laundry. So, what would you pick?
No, I'll go for the robot option. I think that's option 3, right? Yeah, I think I at this point in my life, I think I really need that. And you don't have to, presumably you don't have to pay the robot, so that would be great.
Very sensible. With 2 little babies, I think Hometimus sounds like a great choice. At least you'll get some good sleep. Kwang Yang, great. That was a lovely discussion. Thank you very much for joining the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
Dear listeners, goodbye for now. Until the next episode, take care and keep smiling.